Are you looking for a better operating system? Was the last time you tried to install Debian Linux just too darn difficult for you? Well, maybe it's time you gave Stormix 2000 a try. That might have been what I told you 20 years ago. The problem is Stormix did not stand the true tests of time. In this episode of Shouptech, I would like to explore the very first Linux distribution I ever tried. There is a brief upcoming history lesson, and I will be sure to put links to all of my references in the video's description. In February of 1999, a company called Stormix was founded as a startup venture based out of Vancouver, Canada. Stormix was spun off of NetNation, at the time one of the largest virtual hosting providers in the world, also based out of Vancouver. Stormix's main focus was to build a distribution that will, quote, fit the needs of the desktop user as well as large corporate business situations. Whatever that means. The first release of Stormix is based off of Debian 2.1. Debian has always had a reputation for being difficult to install, and that is not without merit. Even Linus Torvalds himself found it difficult to install.
Yeah. It's well known around these parts that in 2007 you did an interview where you said that although you've used many Linux distributions, you had never used Debian because you found it difficult to install.
Yes.
Have you tried it since?
No.
If you'd like to see firsthand just how difficult it could be, I highly recommend you check out this video from N Commander, where he walks through the difficulties of installing Debian 2.1. Stormix, on the other hand, did not share Debian's complex installer. Instead, it received heaps of praise upon its release for how easy it was to install. The reviewer from the Maximum Linux magazine ended his review with, quote, "Overall, Stormix 2000 tastes pretty good. With a bit more seasoning, however, it would taste even better." After the release of Stormix 2000 in very early 2000, Stormix decided to release more products based off of its Linux distribution. Over the next year, the company would release a software firewall product, a new release of Stormix based off of Debian Potato, and a rack mount server. They even had professional services, which were purportedly the only thing that actually ever made the company much money. Unfortunately, as tasty as Stormix was, Stormix themselves wasn't able to weather the storms and filed for bankruptcy in January of 2001. By April of that year, a notice was posted on Stormix's website announcing their hibernation. It ended with the quote, "Long live the open source movement, Linux, and Debian." Now, Stormix has always held a special place in my heart. It was the very first Linux distribution I ever had the pleasure of trying. It all started many years ago when I was a teenager perusing the magazine rack at the local Borders bookstore. And what did I find but this copy of Linux Format. This is the second issue ever of Linux Format, and I was completely enamored by the idea that you could get a complete operating system with a magazine. That was pretty freaking sweet. Now, I originally tried this on our family's old computer, which was a Pentium MMX compact Presario kind of thing, and it worked. It worked okay. Throughout the next few years, I would try many different Linux distributions, and honestly, Stormix was what really got me into it. Now, I never really daily drove Linux during that time. It was just too much of a difficult thing for me to do. But 20 years later, I can't imagine using anything else. So, was Stormix really all that it was hyped up to be? Let's find out by installing it on this Premium Pentium 2 PC. To begin, I'm going to boot this PC off of a CD. I no longer have the original CD that came with the Linux Format magazine, but I do have this CD that came with a different magazine, Maximum Linux. If for some reason your PC couldn't boot from a CD, there were ways to make a floppy disk. After inserting and booting from the CD, pressing enter at the boot prompt will load the Storm Linux installer. Accept the license agreement and the installer does a quick detection for SCSI or CD-ROM devices. There is then a screen to detect the mouse. Simply moving mine detected the PS2 mouse automatically. From here, you can choose a graphical or text install. Text might be useful if your graphics card isn't detected. I chose graphical. Once the installer finished loading, it displays a list of hardware detected. In my case, most everything was discovered. My Rage 2C was detected as an ATI 3D Rage Pro, and it will install the Mach64X server. The network card was likewise discovered with the appropriate module being loaded. Unfortunately, it does not appear that my sound card was detected, which means I'll likely need to install drivers manually. Select the right keyboard, and then you get to configure the X server. I decided to use 24-bit colors at a resolution of 1024 by 768. After that, I was greeted by a long list of monitors to choose from. This is probably the most frustrating part of this install. Unfortunately, my particular monitor is not in the list, and there were no generic monitors that matched its specs. Also, unlike other distributions, Storm Linux did not allow the manual configuration of horizontal and vertical sync rates. In the end, I selected something that ran at 1024 by 768 at 60 Hz. I knew this would be okay. Once everything is configured, we get to test the display to make sure everything is set up correctly. Now, to partition the disk. For the install, I chose Express, which simply erases the entire drive and dedicates it to Storm Linux. There is a custom option if you want to set up your partitions in a different manner. After partitioning, the installer then formats your partitions. This could take a long while. On my 32GB SD card, this took about 8 minutes. On an old hard drive, this could be a painstakingly long process. Now, to configure the bootloader. This is your chance to add another operating system such as Windows that lives on another disk drive or perhaps a partition on the same disk. I didn't have anything else, so I just clicked Next. Almost there, folks, just a few more steps. Time to configure networking. I was dismayed to see that DHCP couldn't be configured during the installation, so I declined to configure it. After networking, it's time to configure a user and root passwords. Now the time zone selected. We just need to find Denver, which is found underneath the 7 different Eastern time zones, 4 of which are for Indiana alone. Here's the fun part. Selecting what packages to install. You can select an entire group or click Details and select individual packages. I chose to install everything. Why not? I have the disk space. The last step of the install is to select a desktop environment. Here you get to choose KDE or GNOME for your default environment, and you can install both. Also, if you don't want to run X at startup, you don't have to. I chose KDE as default and wanted to install both of them. One final click on Next, and it is off to the races. Installation of the base system and packages took 20 minutes from CD. Time to remove the CD and restart the computer. I just love Storm's default theme for Lilo. The first boot took a while as it ran through all of the package's post-install scripts. A minute later, and I was greeted by this wonderful login prompt. Let's log in and explore. After installing, the first thing I wanted to do was to see if the sound card worked. I knew the installer couldn't detect my sound card, but I still held out hope that it would just work. Alas, no such luck. Running ls-mod reveals the only module loaded is for my network card. The sound card I have installed is a Sound Blaster Live, which uses the EMU10K1 chip. Fortunately, I was able to find Linux drivers to compile from SourceForge. This was a mildly frustrating process and reminded me why I found Linux difficult to use 20 years ago. The first step was to get the source for the kernel that I was using. I found this on the CD-ROM used for the installation. I wish this would have been installed by default. I've already copied the tarball with a driver to the root user's home directory, so I just needed to extract it. I perused the docs that came with the drivers and discovered I needed to at least have the kernel source configured as if I was going to build the kernel. Also, apparently installing the package for the kernel source just put a tarball in user source that needed to be extracted. I copied the boot config to the kernel source tree and ran make dep. I still had one more step before I could compile the module. I had to edit the version header for the kernel source and append the version string with -storm so that it matched the exact version string of the kernel that is running. Now I was able to edit the config for the module compile and point it to the kernel source tree. I then had to run make not once but twice. Following that, a make install puts the modules in their right location and I was able to load the module. The docs next told me to configure the alias for the modules and to run update modules. I also added the sound module to the list in etc modules to be loaded at startup. Last but not least, I had to add my user to the audio group so that it could interact with the mixer device nodes. Next, a reboot was in order. Once I logged in, I was pleasantly greeted with a default KDE sound for logins. At this point, I was satisfied and gave myself a pat on the back for having done a great job. Seriously, this was not an easy process and was very typical of the time period if you had hardware that was relatively modern. The Sound Blaster Live was released in 1998, well before the Linux kernel version 2.2.14 was released. It would have been nice if this would work out of the box, but as a Linux user in 2000, you pretty much needed to know how to compile modules. Now that sound is working, let's get networking set up. To do this, Stormix provided a tool called Storm Administration System. For a GUI from the time period, this was actually relatively straightforward to use. I configured DNS and enabled DHCP. It is at this time I want to provide a warning. Putting a 20-year-old operating system with countless unpatched security vulnerabilities on the internet is not a safe thing to do. In my case, this computer is isolated from the rest of my network and has absolutely no personal information on it, so I felt okay putting it online only temporarily. This is not something I would suggest long term. Next thing to do was to connect to the package repositories. Unfortunately, Stormix's FTP server is no longer working. I was, however, able to point it to Debian's archive mirror and get packages for Slink. Let's try installing something from the repositories. Lin City is an open source game based on SimCity, and I wanted to see if it would actually work. This took a long time as I could not figure out what the right binary to run was, even after installing all of the Lin City packages. I did eventually figure it out and get it working, though I have to say I had no idea what I was doing once the game started. Great, we've got some packages installed. Let's try browsing the web now. Here is where you see the limitations of running really old web browsers. I launched Netscape, yes, Netscape, and discovered only a handful of websites would even render properly, and a lot of the bookmarks that came pre-configured were just plain broken. Surprisingly, Google's search engine rendered fairly well, but of course searching for anything resulted in suboptimal experiences. I then noticed that the time on my computer was wrong. It just dawned on me. This installer never, at any time, asked me to set the correct date and time, only the time zone. I guess it assumed you had the BIOS time correct. Anyways, off to the terminal to set the time as I couldn't find any GUI to do so for me. The next application I opened was GIMP. This image manipulation program has been around for seemingly forever, and I wanted to see how it evolved. On one hand, it seems like little has changed, but on the other hand, a lot has changed. I quickly drew a picture and played around with whatever apps came pre-installed for viewing pictures. The last application I wanted to find was a word processor. Being in high school in the year 2000, I would need to write research papers. Normally, I would do this in Microsoft Word or something similar, but let's see what Storm Linux has to offer. KDE was no help here. I found both a text editor and an advanced text editor. The former was KEdit, and the latter was KWrite. Neither of these were very useful word processing though, as they were just simply text editors. Except for KEdit being able to print and send emails, I really couldn't figure out the differences between these two. Let's move on to GNOME then, and see if there's a word processor installed in that environment. GNOME complained that it couldn't resolve my computer's hostname when it launched, but that didn't seem to break anything. GNOME, by the way, is an absolute blast from the past. It had the Enlightenment window manager on top of it, and everything had this faux brushed metal look. I loved it, and it's really a sight to behold. Now, I was still looking for a word processor, so I opened up gedit. This was just another text editor. Still not what I was looking for. Notepad Plus looked promising. I could set font types, and it had buttons for things like alignment and lists. Except, no. I discovered it was actually just yet another text editor, and the formatting buttons were really for HTML tags. Okay, fine. Let's see if we can look up a word processor using one of the applications that Storm Linux was proud of, its package manager. I was able to search and discover it knew of a package called Abby Word, which sounded very promising. Unfortunately, I could not figure out how to install it using either the Storm Package Manager or apt-get. I'm chalking this up to not having access to any of the original package repositories. I remember this kind of thing working better 20 years ago. I finally decided to pop in the Storm Linux CD and see if packages for Abby Word reside on it. Lo and behold, there it was! I thought I selected everything during this solve, but clearly Abby Word is not part of everything. I was done, and had spent far too long not being productive. I'd made use of virtual desktops and ran a game on one desktop while producing some output on the other. As defined by the Oxford English Dictionary, nostalgia is a sentimental longing or wistful affection for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations. My memories of Storm Linux can be best described as just that, nostalgia. I'd momentarily forgotten the many frustrations of running Linux on the desktop at that time. I would like to think other distributions were much easier to work with, but honestly I think Storm Linux was one of the easiest. For the next at least 10 years I would bounce back and forth between Windows and other Linux distributions before I really settled on using Linux on my personal desktop full time. Honestly, Linux for a long time was just a frustrating experience to daily drive. These days it is so much better. Seriously everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you could take a moment and hit that like button, I would be very grateful. Also, if you want to see more explorations of retro Linux things, please hit that subscribe button. Next time, I think we'll take a look at the second distribution I ever tried, and another one that is also no longer around, Corel Linux.